instead of giving you a soup to nuts John Marshall thing, most of what I like to think about history is how it tells stories and how much fun it can be, as opposed to, I suppose, turgid and dull things that you read because some teacher told you you had to. There's certainly a lot out there that's that way. Ken Burns's stuff and David McCullough writes in that sort of fashion, and that's sort of my. Those are, if I wouldn't call them mentors, but they were examples of what I like. So much of my book, it has 8 or 9 little American history essays in it, like when did the founding of the country really end, or Marshall could have become president. What other people could have become president that didn't? From Adlai Stevenson and Henry Clay, who ran a few times, to people like Jefferson Davis, who could have become president. He was sort of the horse whisperer for Franklin Pierce. He was the most influential person in his cabinet, but he decided not to run for some reason in 1856, after Pierce's time was done. So anyway, and I'll talk to you a little bit about James Buchanan and why I would write a book called Worst President Ever. It came out in 2016. I've yet to write my thank you notes to Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump for making the sales of my book so much better. I even got a notice that today, even in 2020, it's still controversial enough, or 2021, that I have a check coming. But it was fun to have it come out then, because people were all talking about who really would be the worst president. And I assure you that had Mrs. Clinton become president, there would have been a monstrous wave of people who didn't like her either. But in any case, why write about somebody like John Marshall? Why today would I care about this sort of thing? And I can give you one word that tells you this, and that's Hamilton. And not that I wanted, Lin Miranda to take my book and make it into a musical, although he could. Marshall was the same kind of guy as Hamilton. He was everywhere. He was like the Forrest Gump of the founders. He was at Valley Forge and in many other places along the way. And he had sort of a gusto to him, an interesting sort of, he was more of a partier than Hamilton was, to tell you the truth. But in any case, in that kind of person. But we see him as we see many of the founders in some sort of dressy kind of thing, and they're sort of stodgy. I know there's in Philadelphia, where I live. I live in southern New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. There's a Jefferson hospital system, and you see this portrait of Jefferson they have there, and you sort of think, like, do I really want to go to the hospital here, like with some stodgy guy that they named it after? But these guys weren't necessarily stodgy. Some of them were, obviously. I worked at a TV station in Philadelphia, and often I would produce the 11 o'clock news, and it was right on Independence Mall, a block from Independence Hall, across the street from the Liberty Bell. And I would come out some nights, and there would be sort of a haze over the street lamps in the city, and I could almost see in the distance, like Jefferson and Ben Franklin walking down the street arm in arm, and seeing over there, like over there across the street, like Caesar Rodney from Delaware. He said, they say, "Caesar, great party last night, gotta get together again." Because that's what they were. They were. I wouldn't say that everybody was drinking and partying all the time, but they loved conversing. All these, especially during the Constitutional Convention, where many of these people came together who had never seen each other before, or the Declaration of Independence, and they knew that they were prominent people in their state, like the people that were thinking this of their own. And one of the wonders of our country and the founding of our country is that the time and space it took to get from one place to another. There'd never been a rather quick founding of a country like this. Russia was not founded as quickly as the United States was. And you start thinking, like, how did the people in New Hampshire know what the people in South Carolina were thinking? I mean, it took days and days and days to get from one place to another, and you didn't even know who these people were. It wasn't like there was no I-95 coming down, or in your case, I-81 coming down the road. You Virginians, you ought to be sort of honored in this case, but recently I've been studying the 1790, 1800, and 1810 censuses. I'm one of those boys that studied the back of baseball cards as if they were the stairway to heaven. All the statistics. If I were young today, I would probably be in sports analytics. Because I just sort of loved all those figures and trying to think something out of them. Well, so I started looking at these, for most people, eye-rending figures from the census. But in 1800, Virginia was the biggest state. Kentucky had already been sawed off, and yet still Virginia had 21% of the country's population. It wasn't just the biggest state, it was by far the biggest state. It didn't have New York in it, as New York did, and that was the second biggest state in population. I'm not talking about size. And so it had been the most influential state. In the, when the Constitution was made, nine states of the 9 of the 13 colonies, it said that if 9 of the 13 colonies passed this resolution, or whatever you want to call it, there would be the country of the United States with the Constitution as we sort of know it. And let me just say that we all sort of know it as the ruling document. But good luck if you didn't have Virginia and New York, and they didn't. The 9th state to do it was New Hampshire. There were still 4 colonies left. There was North Carolina, there was Rhode Island. Rhode Island was like always the kicker. Rhode Island didn't like anything, and Virginia and New York. Well, if they stopped there, like I said, good luck for your country. I mean, that was that much of a country if the 2 most influential states were not part of it. So it came down to Virginia really debating this document, and the ruler, the sort of the boss of Virginia, was Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry from "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death," a speech that was never recorded, and the first citation of it was in 1811 by his grandson, who wrote a biography of him. So maybe he said it and maybe he didn't. Certainly the longer version of it can't possibly be word for word true. But there were several people there of note. Jefferson was there, for instance, when he gave that speech, and sort of said this is probably what he said, and it was passed down in oral history. But in any case, Patrick Henry is the boss, and he does not want the Constitution. He thinks that Virginia can go it alone, and at the very most, go back to the Articles of Confederation, where he sort of had a loose European Union-like confederation, where everybody would be, to all intents and purposes, independent. Maybe they'd gather together for an army or certain kinds of tariff treaties or something like that. And this is what Patrick Henry thought was the way they should go. He was very influential, but John Marshall took it upon himself. Marshall had moved up in the chain, and I'll get back to how easy it was to be a founding father. Of course, the idea you were founding mother would not really, there were several people who had some influence, like Abigail Adams, but she was the wife of somebody. Anyway, so Marshall took it upon himself to take the other side, and he had been up and back to Philadelphia to see how things were working. Knew Washington was Washington's chief acolyte. Really, he loved Washington, and Washington was friends of his father, and had always looked out after young Marshall with a pat on the head. But Marshall took on Patrick Henry and was able to convince enough Virginians to pass the Constitution, to ratify the Constitution. Now, perhaps it was because there were already 9 that had done it, and there was some influence there. But Marshall sort of gave the other idea, and I think people, even James Madison was sort of a Federalist. He wrote some of the Federalist Papers. So even people who eventually broke off and became Democrat Republicans or Jeffersonian Democrats or whatever you want to call them, that receded from this idea of a strong federal government, at that time decided that this was the better way. But they only won by 10 votes. It was so close in many states to the Constitution not passing. And then soon after, New York did, and then you had a real country. North Carolina soon came in, and Rhode Island waited till, I don't know if they still passed the Constitution up there. It failed several times, and then they were going to rescind it after they passed it. But this is not the history of Rhode Island here. But in any case, Marshall became even more influential, and in fact, Jefferson was coming back from his time in Europe. And as much as it was important to have ambassadors, or what they weren't yet ambassadors, but Americans in Europe, and especially in France and England, to do stuff, they were, just think about how long it took communication to get there. Madison kept Jefferson apprised of what was going on, but if you were lucky, that boat crossed the ocean, in a month and a half. And you weren't lucky all the time. So let's just say most communications took 2 to 3 months to get one way. So let's say Madison writes it, like everything that happened that day, everything that happened that last month, to Jefferson. And Jefferson was smart enough. He knew that when the letter got there, things may have changed. So when Jefferson came back, even as influential as he was, writing the Declaration of Independence, one of the great thinkers of his time, he comes back to Virginia and he's like nobody. Well, nobody is not really the case, but people have taken over his fame, including Marshall. And Marshall was now besides Henry, the most prominent legislator. Even Madison was a lesser voice in national politics, and certainly in Virginia politics. So anyway, I now want to go back to why it's so easy to become a founding father at this time. You glorify these people, but just think, they're in 1790, in the 1790 census, which is after, you would start thinking about founders, of course. There were 3.8 million people in the country. However, only 800,000 of them were white males over 16. And those are the people who could vote. right? Those are the people who could be founding fathers, if you wanted, if that was your goal. Take away say the 16 to 21-year-olds and say they're 750,000. Now that sounds like a lot of people, but let's face it, 750,000. What's that? I don't know. It's probably less than the metropolitan area of Richmond, right? So in any case, there was also as you probably know, coming from this area, Marshall's youth was spent sort of about an hour and a half to the northeast of where you are, the northeast of Harrisonburg, in sort of rural areas. When you think about that, that's not really that far from the current Washington, D.C., which of course didn't exist then. But it wasn't, as we look at it now, it wasn't far out, but it really, for those people, it was far out. And Marshall's father, like I said, he was a friend of Washington, and he took up surveying like Washington had. He was sort of a farmer before that, but he was not a poor person. But surveyors back then weren't like whatever surveyors would be now, or people who do the boundary lines of your houses, your property, with the drop ball and the sites and making everything exact. They were sort of just guys who went out into the countryside and convinced people they were surveyors. A rich person would say to George Washington or John Marshall that, can you go out and I'd like 5,000 acres out there. And they would go out and instead of getting paid in money, what was more important was to have some land. So Marshall's father accumulated a lot of land around what he called Germantown, or what was called Germantown back then. I guess it's Germantown Road up there. And so when the call for soldiers comes out as the war starts coming down from Massachusetts to more southern areas, Marshall, as a landowner, not only signs up, Marshall's dad, but he becomes a larger officer, a captain, a major, whatever. He called himself whatever he wanted to. And Marshall the Younger, who had learned a lot of his soldiering from his father, who hadn't been a soldier yet, becomes a lieutenant, because he probably has 10 or 12 people he can grab and bring up to show Patrick Henry, who's the governor at the time, that we have some people who want to go up there and be with Washington. The war was really rather loosey-goosey. This was not people mustering out to some base and getting prepared in some formal way. This was people following General Washington, the guy. He was the big guy. He was the person that people followed. He was, Muhammad Ali. He was, Mussolini. They actually called him They would always call him some sort of name like that, like minister, or so, his soldiers would have various sort of sarcastic names for what he was, the emperor. So they sort of get into the war about the time it's going around Philadelphia, and there's battles of Germantown and Brandywine that the revolutionaries, the Washington's army, doesn't do very well at. So they have to recede, and it's getting towards the winter, and they recede to a place called Valley Forge. Now, let me tell you something about Valley Forge. It's not in a valley. How stupid that would be to be in a valley, when you're trying to get through the winter. How vulnerable you would be, you want to be on high ground, which it is. If you go out to Valley Forge, it's on high ground. They start building huts to make it through the winter, and their foundations are pretty solid. They sort of clear the foundation, clear an area, put this hut up, and sort of shore it up high with dirt, knowing that the winter is coming. When we think of Valley Forge, we often think of people with paper shoes and no clothes, closing themselves off and freezing. That really wasn't what happened in Valley Forge. It was cold, but it was just a Philadelphia winter, and supplies were intermittent. They did get there because there were sympathizers in places like Bethlehem and Westchester, not that far away, to get them supplies. Most of the people who died in Valley Forge died towards the end of the winter when it started getting less cold and all the fecal matter and whatever was still there and not drained off, and there was disease. More people died of disease than of cold. In fact, there was a whole cadre of wives and families that lived up there too. It wasn't just soldiers. It was an odd thing that we remember it that way. But what Marshall became, and where Marshall made his bones in the Army, is that he was a jock. When his father taught him mostly athletics when he was at home. They had books at home, which was rare in that time, have more than one book. Marshall went to 1 year of school. His father sent him to an academy in Southern Virginia somewhere, and he met James Monroe there. But that was it. A traveling minister came by 1 year and taught him a little bit as well, probably more religion than academics. But he made it by himself in some way. But he was sort of an athlete. And so he gets to Valley Forge and he says, I'm going to make these people a little happier. I'm going to start games and that sort of thing. So he was sort of the rec director of Valley Forge. And he was the fastest runner, and he had white stockings his mother sent to him, and they called him Silver Heels. And there's another part of another journal that says that he used to leap over a board that was placed on the heads of two soldiers. So he was sort of the Bruce Jenner, I guess, of Valley Forge. He was the Olympian before there was Olympics. He eventually fought for about a year through the battles in New Jersey after Valley Forge, but then decided he was going to come home. His enlistment was up. His father, by that time, had gotten a job in Yorktown, nearby to the capital in Williamsburg, and it was some sort of military something or other there. So Marshall says, I'm going to go there. Well, as he's going there, the word of this young war hero comes, and there's a family called the Amblers who live there. The dad has also some sort of governmental or military job. All of this is sort of vague, and they have 3 teenage daughters, not named Schuyler, as Hamilton would, but Ambler. And we find this out mostly from the older daughter's journal. When Marshall is coming, this war hero that they don't know what he looks like, the youngest daughter says, well, he's going to be mine. I'm going to do what I'm going to do to attract him. So she's 13 years old. Her name's Polly Ambler. And so Marshall gets there and suddenly comes in, and he's not what they're expecting. He's like sort of gangly, and he's wearing a fringed jacket like John Voight did in Midnight Cowboy, and he's got sort of a hat that's sort of askew, that sort of a fun hat, that he thought of as a military hat, and he's wearing boots, and he's sort of shy, and he has manners, but they're sort of rural manners. So he's not the most attractive guy at the party. And but young Polly says doesn't matter. So she uses her wiles or whatever the cliche would be, and Marshall is smitten. He cannot believe that this girl is trying to attract her. I mean, she was obviously pretty at least, but she's 13 years old and he's in his 20s. What he decides to do is he wants to stay around. So he goes to Williamsburg, to William and Mary, or the nascent William and Mary, or whatever William and Mary was. And there's a guy named George Wythe who lives there, as in Wytheville, down way down 81 and 77. And he's the legal scholar of America, basically. And if you want to become a lawyer, you study with, and big deal, you study with George. And so Marshall walks over and says, okay, well, doesn't walk over, rides a horse, I'm sure. And Wythe says, okay, and he starts studying with him. It's not quite like a law school as you think of today, but he has enough pupils. In the meantime, and Thomas Jefferson had studied with him. And Thomas Jefferson actually was John Marshall's second cousin, related through the Randolph family of who their mothers were both part of. Meanwhile, as he's studying with in his papers, we can look in his legal notes, and it's like being a junior high girl of my era, at any rate. And he would have on the notes, Polly A and John M, JM and PA, things like that. He was, like I said, so smitten with her, he couldn't stop thinking about it, even as he's studying for the law. In several weeks after this, and Marshall is over at the Amblers as much as he can be, the dad gets another job. Now, the other thing that the dad is the husband of Thomas Jefferson's real love. Thomas Jefferson had proposed to her. She refuses him, and then later on marries Ambler, and of course then becomes. I'm not giving it away that Marshall eventually marries Polly Ambler. She's 15 by that time, but they had gotten a job. The dad had gotten a job in Richmond, to be the new capital. So he's going off, and Marshall says, "Huh, I got no reason to stay here." Quits law school after 5 or 6 weeks. So this is the entirety of the studies of the man who becomes the great Supreme Court Chief Justice. 1 year of school at about 10. A little bit of a reverend, and about 5 or 6 weeks of William and Mary writing stuff, for the great master. In the meantime, Thomas Jefferson is now governor of Virginia. So Marshall writes a note to Jefferson. He wants to become certified as an attorney, and Jefferson does this. Jefferson eventually becomes Marshall's greatest rival, but not quite yet. And of course, he's not quite married this, Polly, to make Jefferson matter. But Jefferson doesn't like him again because he marries into the family of the woman who spurned him. But anyway, Marshall gets to Richmond, and within a couple of years, he gets on various committees. He becomes the go-to lawyer in Richmond. And you say that's great, but big deal. Richmond has 2,600 people. It's not as if that's the biggest deal in the world, but Marshall makes the most of it. And Richmond is the capital, and it's got no paved roads. In the middle of the road between the main hotel, where Marshall eventually initially takes up residence, and the presumed capital, which is like a Amazon warehouse. It's just a barn like structure that nobody wants to go to. And frankly, nobody wants to go to Richmond. There's no place to stay. And there's just filth all over the streets and everything, but they go. And that's the way, that's sort of Richmond of that era. But Marshall gets various jobs and elected to various things in the state legislature. As I told you, he helps ratify the Constitution, and eventually becomes a congressman and goes to Philadelphia. And he mostly leaves Polly in Richmond. That's sort of the way it is. You never know how long you're going to be at this place, and it's a rough road to get there. He becomes more famous because he gets sent to Europe to get a treaty with the French. The French decide that he needs to pay bribes. He's there with two other people. One of them is of the jury, of the gerrymander. I think his real pronunciation is Gary. But in any case, Marshall of the three hates this idea that that they're going to pay a bribe, and he's not going to do it. And he refuses to do it. And Gary comes back with him. The third man stays there just in case, but he comes back a hero because the word comes back that he wouldn't kowtow to the French, who were, big deals. He gets a great parade in Philadelphia, an honored hero, even though he didn't have to fight in the war. And like I said, he's now in Congress. So he like I said, he really reveres Washington. Washington offers him several jobs in the administration, including Attorney General. He turns them all down because he feels that he can do better as either a state legislator or a national legislator. And when Washington dies on December 14th, 1799, the word is that they have to get the word to his favorite, legislator, John Marshall. You know how long it takes to get from this word from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia? It took 3.5 days. It doesn't get there till the 18th of December. This is the way the country was. That's why it's so amazing that anything happened. There is no, like I said, there's no I-95. There's not even any Washington yet. So how do you get from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia? You sort of cut through forests. There's no GPS. You have to ford streams with your horse. You have to get other horses. You have to rest. It's just a monumental pain. But it finally gets to Philadelphia. Marshall is sort of the honcho of the funerals and the memorials. And soon after, he's now prominent enough that towards the end of his whatever you want to call it, administration, John Adams makes Marshall Secretary of State. Now, Secretary of State is not what we think of it today. It's mostly Chief of Staff, pretty much. He's sort of organized. He's a big organizer, administrator. And the bureaucracy is great. Marshall has 4 employees in the State Department, 4 employees. The big department was Treasury, which Alexander Hamilton had started, and that was really a big department. It had 39 people. So the entire government, or at least the administrative part of the government, War had some other people, and the Attorney General had some lawyers. It was 100 people at most in the executive branch. But still, this is what was running the country. And what was great about this, if you were of that age, is that you could take something and make something of it. Because Washington made what it is to be president. He dressed down for that era. So we had a less formal thing than the kings in Europe. He led by example. He was a kind man, but he was firm. He had opinions. He was able to subvert his opinions to make everybody happy. He got the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians to meet on certain things, and he was revered. He was a general. He won. The greatest thing that George Washington did on a regular basis was retreat. His goal was to outlast the British army. That someday they would just go home if we didn't fight them all the time. So as you know, differently than the Civil War, there weren't as many battles in the Revolutionary War as long as it took. There were some, and there were skirmishes, and they were made into battles. The Battle of Trenton, lasted about 5 hours and involved virtually no casualties. The sort of the battle that turned the country around. But in any case, we're back to Marshall, who becomes Secretary of State. And one of the things that happens at this point is they're building the new Capitol. It gets to be named Washington, because Washington died just before it gets really started. John Adams hated the hot weather. He's from Massachusetts. He loved being in Massachusetts. He could barely stand Philadelphia and New York, the early capitals, but there he felt like he had to be in the milieu. But there was a point in his administration, which was only 4 years long, where he spent 7 consecutive months in Quincy, Massachusetts. Now, it's not like he had Twitter and Facebook. He did, or a phone or telegraph, nothing. He wrote a lot of letters, and he tried, I'm sure he tried to keep the government going, but he parceled a lot of stuff out to a lot of people. And Congress, which was Federalist, his party helped him along. But when he gets down to Washington, it starts getting hot, and it's only April. And he says, I don't like it here very much. This is 1800. He looks to Marshall and he says, you do it. And so Marshall, in addition to becoming Secretary of State, is now the general contractor of Washington, D.C. He haunches the building of the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury Building, and several minor buildings. Those were the 3 main buildings when the Washington became the capital. He's probably the first person to sleep in the White House, because why not? He's supervising the building, and it's better at some point than the hotel that he was staying at. And but one of the things he did is he did not put indoor plumbing in the White House. So when the Adams family comes back, they have to use outhouses in the back. But Adams always wanted he was the first person to call it the People's House. He wanted people to be able to see it. So people would come along the fence, and I'm sure at some time somebody in the White House is going out to the outhouse. So Jefferson sort of didn't like that. And when he took over, the first thing he did was put indoor plumbing in the White House. I'm not talking about flush toilets. I'm just talking about not having to go outside. Marshall then, and then we have this thing called the Supreme Court. And it's not, the other 2 branches don't view it as sort of much. John Jay is the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He presides over the first session of the Supreme Court, in which there's one case, and that's settled before it gets to be argued. There isn't much going on between the 2 branches yet. There's no states suing, because there hadn't been states very long. There's no federal government being sued. There's not many cases. So Washington sends Jay off to London to negotiate a treaty, which becomes the Jay Treaty, one of the most unpopular treaties ever passed by Congress, because we didn't get much from the British. But it's the same time as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They're sending him out of the country. Can you imagine this now? I mean, can you imagine like Biden going to John Roberts and said, would you go off, and settle this thing in the Middle East for me? Spend some time over there, get to know the Palestinians, get to know the Israelis, come back in a few months. Not likely to happen. Now, but this is the way, we say, oh, the founders did this, the founders did that, we got to follow them. Well, they did a lot of other things too. And the third Supreme Court Chief Justice also had this issue. He was sent off to France to negotiate a treaty with the Barbary pirates, and he gets sick, Oliver Ellsworth, and he just can't get on a boat to come back. He sends a note on the boat. He says, I guess I have to quit because I'm staying here and getting well before I come back to America. And so Marshall then goes, as Secretary of State, goes to Adams and says, puts up a list of people that might be. And Adams looks at him and he says, I think it's going to be you. So he becomes Supreme Court Chief Justice at the same time that he's Secretary of State. I'm going to let you read my book to know about Marbury versus Madison, the first great Supreme Court case that he does. But what's funny now is we look at the people complain about the Supreme Court being 3 liberals and 6 conservatives, and is Stephen Breyer going to quit, or is it going to be 7-2 when he dies, or something like this? But at the turn of Jefferson beating Adams on March 4th, 1801, every federal judge, every federal, even employee like Justice of the Peace, which is what Marbury was a Federalist. Every single one. The ruling party that we won the Congress and the presidency had no federal judges, none. 50-some judges and all Federalists. So, we think the country survived. It was a little crazy, and one of the things that I would say is that Marshall is really tantamount to the savior of the government. He decides a way to adjudicate cases. He makes an excuse. He'll find a case, and he will get the Supreme Court as a unit to look at these cases, and will opt every time for federalism. Will opt every time to have the federal government be stronger than the states. There will be always sops. He's very good at that, giving sops to one side and making the decision to be that kind of decision. You can look through all of his cases and see that. It's just a string of cases over 34 years as Chief Justice. And he becomes the Chief Justice as the only Federalist left at some point. All the other people die. He doesn't. And the new people are all Jeffersonian Democrats and later Jacksonian Democrats. But what Marshall takes upon himself is to keep the country whole. And he does this by elevating the Supreme Court into something. When the Capitol is built, the Supreme Court is given a space in the basement. And in that space in the basement on Saturday nights, often there are dances. And on Sunday mornings, often there are church services. This is the Supreme Court building. This is how much it was valued, that they rented it out to make some money on Saturday and Sunday. Marshall, however, through all of the decisions that he writes, and he writes most of them, elevates the Supreme Court. Their states come there and want things adjudicated. The federal bank once somebody sues them, has to go to the Supreme Court. Where is it going to go? And it's Marshall that marshals the forces. So anyway, like I said, he becomes a founder, as many of them do, through grit, I suppose. So that's a few stories of the story of our country. So I'm happy now to take questions, or take Paul's questions, or to take Susan's questions, and then I'll probably tell another story when you do. Oh, you want to talk about the University of Virginia?
Yes, that was the question I'm going to, excuse me, I was going to start off with. But I do want to quickly just say again, if anybody in the audience does have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to definitely try and get to all the questions that you guys have. But I do have one because this is having read the book, and I love the book. But the introduction, I think, is you do a great job of kind of introducing your own kind of tie to all this. And one of the stories you have is um, you're going through this area with your dad and you stop off at UVA. Your father is able to get the archivist at UVA to give you a viewing of Jeffersonville. But can you kind of tell the story of how this happens and what
Right.
everything? Because I think it's a great story that about you and again your father with that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, like many people, my father was very influential in my life, and I was an only child, but he was a great history buff, and we didn't go many places, but this one trip in 1961, it was the centennial of the Civil War, and so he was such a Civil War uh, crazy guy. He belonged to the Lincoln Civil War Society. God knows where he found it, but I remember it being in sort of a Tenderloin section of Philadelphia, up a stairs in somebody's office. But in any case, we're down around here, and I don't know how he gets this, but we get to the University of Virginia, and of course he liked Jefferson too, so he wanted to see Jefferson's University, and we go into the library. Well, I don't know what magic came about him, but he says, I'm going to see Jefferson's will. Now, this is at a time when they weren't out in glass cases. They were in some vault somewhere, right? And he goes up to the desk, and I remember in my memory, it's probably not exactly true, this meek librarian. And my father, who was small but forceful, said, in some hurried voice, he says, I want to see Jefferson's will. I want to photograph Thomas Jefferson's will. Judge Jones of Charlottesville told me I could come. Well, I'm sure Judge Jones of Charlottesville didn't exist. It was just something he made up. My father was a municipal court judge, and he finally convinces this librarian to bring it out. Probably shaking his hand and worrying whether he's going to get fired. And my father takes a few photographs and says thank you. And he goes back home and he frames this photograph. It's two framed objects. He puts it in his office, and I have it in my office. Now I can tell you that a digital version of Thomas Jefferson's will would pop up very, very nicely on your screen. But for me, I've got this will that I remember, and the stories the things about my father and his sort of obsession, and continuing on in that trip down closer to you, he wants to go to Woodrow Wilson's house in Stanton, down there. And we get to Woodrow Wilson's house, and he practically runs up to the door, and I can't even follow him in my 10-year-old feet. And before I get there, he's walking back, and he's just so glum. And I go to the door, and on it is a 3x5 card, really just a 3x5 card that says the Woodrow Wilson house is closed today because Mrs. Wilson died. He said Mrs. Wilson died that the only day my father finally gets to the Wilson house, and he can't go in. So, this is how I became so enamored of American history.
Was it just a random aside question? Was he ever able to go back and actually visit the house another time, or
I did, but he didn't.
he didn't? Oh, okay, all right. So we have a question from the audience. What drew you to John Marshall as a subject?
Okay, I had done this book on Buchanan, James Buchanan, and my editor called it worst period, present period ever, and I hated it because it was so juvenile. But it came very easy because when I would go out and talk, even if the person didn't read the book, they could talk about the worst president in some, or they thought, so it was very successful. I was everywhere on TV and in every sort of newspaper and radio station all around the country because it was the 2016 election. not because of Buchanan or not because of me. And I tried to make it fun, so when this happens to you and you're sort of a not Stephen King author, and you have sort of this 2-book deal, wasn't really a 2-book deal, but they got right of first refusal. They come and say, well, you got to write about another biography, another historical biography, because this one was successful, right? So I pick Henry Clay. And so they go, write this proposal and they say, oh, Henry Clay, there's never been a good selling biography of Henry Clay. And I went to the James Buchanan, it's like, there wasn't any of that either. John Updike wrote a play about James Buchanan. And John Updike, a famous writer, it never got produced. Now, if John Updike could do it, write this play, and nobody cared about it, how big was Buchanan in the pantheon? But anyway, so I came around to John Marshall because when I started looking for more people, he became more fascinating to me because he wasn't the guy who just wrote Supreme Court cases. He was the guy who jumped at Valley Forge. He was the guy who started the Quoits Club in Richmond. He was the guy who always had a cask of Madeira ready for a party. He was the guy who said one of his things in the Supreme Court was that he said he could only drink when it rains. So he told one of his Supreme Court justices to go out and pull the curtains. They're like, "What's the weather?" And he said, the Judge Story says, "Well, it's bright and sunny outside." And Marshall says, "Well, it's raining somewhere, Madeira." So he's sort of the Jimmy Buffett of Supreme Court justices too.
Yeah, that sounds like it's much more multi-layered than I know me personally had thought of John Marshall. So another question we have is, what was his relationship with the other founding fathers? Was there one of them that he was closest to? Was there any that he really had like a contentious relationship, or that he just didn't have a good relationship with?
Yes, he did. He eventually did not have a good relationship with Thomas Jefferson, famous.
Yeah.
Even though he was his relative, even though he had, but it started off with getting married into this family.
Yeah.
The people just sort of, have these sort of animosities, and then they became distant in their political views. And at the time that Jefferson took over as the president, Marshall was doing his best to thwart the Jeffersonian ideal of a loose confederation, and he wanted a stronger one. And they were the two rivals, the Supreme Court Chief Justice and the president, and they just didn't like each other. He was close to John Adams and George Washington, and I guess I neglected to say he was given Washington's papers to write the first great biography of George Washington. He gets a contract with this Philadelphia publisher. It's going to be sort of a new thing. It's going to be a series of books like the Book of the Month Club would be, or something like that in later days. And there were going to be 3 volumes, and people sent money in early to buy all 3 volumes. Well, it takes a couple of years before he writes it. It comes out, the first thing comes out, and it's not a biography of George Washington. It's the first chapter of American history. It ends with George Washington's. It doesn't end with George Washington, it ends before George Washington. So people are outraged. They ask for their money back. But he still sort of goes along, tries to write another one. But even John Adams says this is like, this is too turgid to even read. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, there's a guy selling this stuff for this company, and he's a guy named Mason Weems. And he decides, I can do this better. He convinces them he could. He writes this sort of half fiction, half fact, a biography of Washington that many school children of the day knew and knew for 100 years. But of course, it has the chopping down of the cherry tree. It has the wooden teeth. It has everything that you know about Washington that is sort of maybe true. And it sells 50,000 copies. I would be happy to have 50,000 copies, but that's nothing. That's not, anything, today. But back then, that was the bestseller of the first decade of the 19th century.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, no, that definitely sounds like a large number, especially having in the beginning when you talked about how small our country was compared to where we are today. So if you have any other questions for people, please get them in. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So we have one. As kind of most people know, and you talk about this a little bit in your book, the Liberty Bell has that crack in it. And there is that story that kind of goes around about the crack was when it was rung upon John Marshall's death. Is there actually any truth to that story, or is that a myth? And where did that story come from?
Okay, so it comes from part of the thing about being a mythical character is, John Marshall was a mythical character in his time. I mean, even until I have a book here of in 1901, every city did a tribute to John Marshall because it was the 100th anniversary, the ascension to the Supreme Court. And so he dies. He has kidney stones, and then he makes a trip to Philadelphia, where I guess he had a doctor, from the time he had spent in Congress and all. At the time, Philadelphia was the capital, and so he jangles up there. Can you imagine going from Richmond to Philadelphia in a horse carriage with no roads? I mean, and kidney stones. But he gets to Philadelphia in 1832, and he gets cured. He goes back home. But then in 1835, the same thing happens, and he trundles up there, and he goes to Pennsylvania Hospital, which is the first hospital in the United States founded by Benjamin Rush, another lesser-known founding father. And Rush isn't his doctor; he's dead by that time. But the doctor takes out the stones again, and they said there were 1,000 stones. Well, I don't know if there are 1,000 stones, might be pieces or whatever it is, but a lot. Meanwhile, his sons, his oldest son thinks he's on the deathbed. He calls the other sons to come to Philadelphia. One other one makes it, and another son is trying to make it up. He gets to Baltimore. There's a rainstorm. A piece of the siding of the hotel he's in falls, hits him, he gets killed. So on his way to his father, well, a few days later, John Marshall succumbs, probably because they bled him, because that's what they did in those days. And he was old and infirm because he had had all these stones taken out. So it's around July 4th in Philadelphia, so that's a celebration time. And so the word came down from somewhere to somebody in some mythical thing that they rang the Liberty Bell on his death. It cracked and never rang again. Bell 0 for 3. Because it's up in the State House, and it's not the kind of bell that it was rung at that time. You could probably unloose the clapper and do it in some way, but that it wasn't what they did. Second is the Liberty Bell was already cracked. And it didn't crack further on that day, and it wouldn't have, because they shorted up. If you go see the Liberty Bell, you can see how they shorted up. And there was a time when they sort of rang it. They don't do that anymore. It's too many people coming in to see it. But and then later on, when it's viewed as the Liberty Bell, which it was started about that time, abolitionists sort of started calling it the Liberty Bell. It was just the State House bell before that. And it went around on sort of an excursion. One time it went out to San Francisco because there's an exposition there in the part of the 20th century. And people sort of were allowed to take a little, something to clap it. But then Pennsylvania, which actually owned, or Philadelphia, which actually owned the Liberty Bell, decided that this was not going to be good, that people were going to sort of ruin it. And so it came back to Philadelphia. Now it is not rung or cracked or anything like that, but you can go see it and be right up against it. So it did happen. So the myth that people have perpetrated, and I wouldn't call it a great myth, but it is. It does sound good that
Yeah.
this end time, and it ends with the last founder.
Yeah.
Sounds good to make it into a story.
No, I've heard of that myth before, and so I was curious, and so it was interesting to see that you had addressed that in the book. I guess I'm going to end up with one last question, that one of mine that I do like to kind of ask a lot of times with author talk. This is a wonderful book. It's a great book. What's the next project for you?
Okay, so I did 30 years ago. I did a story about the town I grew up in, which was a suburb without any character. No, it had character. It had some sort of suburban character. It did sort of have some of that, but it had no history, is what I should say. So the Philadelphia Inquirer Sunday magazine asked me to do a story about that, a story, the history of a town that had no history. Well, I just became fascinated with this, and I did all these oral histories, and I did obviously too many, and I didn't justify the story. It wasn't the kind of story. It wasn't a book. Anyways, so through the years, I've done more and more oral histories in this town until recently. I had my 50th high school reunion. I started doing all my friends, and not even my friends, other people from my class. So I had more and more stuff. And I decided that I've always thought of my suburb, at least, and maybe other suburbs, as the antithesis of what we think suburbs are, like characterless and all that. That I've always thought of these people as being the pioneers, much like the pioneers going out west and stopping at a river and saying, this is where we're going to have our town. And so they went out in their station wagons instead of their covered wagons. So that's going to be my story, the history of the post-World War II suburbs, sort of having this mass oral history memoir part of it.
That sounds like a really interesting project. I definitely would be interested. And having grown up in the suburbs myself, it would be kind of interesting to see the older and how they started. Well, again, thank you very much, Robert, for chatting with us and the wonderful book talk and all that. I'm going to hold up the book. Hopefully people can see it. It's John Marshall, the final founder. Again, you can get it at our local Barnes & Noble, but online. So definitely get yourself a copy. And again, thanks so much, Robert, for spending time with us and taking the evening with us. We really do appreciate it. The wonderful talk. So thanks again.
And thank you for inviting me. That's it's always fun to do this. As you see, I get very emotional.
And everybody, if you're interested in other events that we're having coming up, you can just take a look at our website, mrlib.org, for any of our upcoming programs, and keep an eye out for a summer reading program for adults. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.